and she was left for dead by settlers until a young Apache found the silent widow who'd given up. Chapter 1. The Silence That Followed. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the charred remains of what had once been a modest homestead. Smoke still curled lazily from the blackened timber of the cabin, and the acrid smell of ash mixed with the metallic tang of blood that had already begun to attract flies. The attack had come at dawn, swift and brutal, leaving nothing but destruction in its wake. Margaret O'Brien lay motionless beside the well, her calico dress torn and stained with dirt and blood. At 32, she had weathered many hardships on the frontier, but nothing had prepared her for this morning's violence. The raiders, drifters, and outlaws who preyed on isolated settlements had taken everything: her husband Samuel's life, their livestock, and what little money they had saved. The wound in her side burned like fire, but Margaret felt a strange detachment from the pain. She had stopped calling for help hours ago. Her voice, once strong enough to call Samuel in from the fields, had been reduced to a whisper, then to nothing at all. The silence that surrounded her seemed to seep into her very bones. "Samuel," she whispered to the empty sky, her lips cracked and dry. But Samuel couldn't hear her anymore. His body lay 20 feet away, a stark reminder of how quickly a life could be extinguished on this unforgiving land. The sun climbed higher, and Margaret closed her eyes. She thought of her sister Elizabeth back in Missouri, who had begged her not to come west. "Nothing good comes from chasing dreams in that godforsaken wilderness," Elizabeth had said. Perhaps she had been right. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret's breathing grew shallow. The wound in her side had stopped bleeding, but infection was setting in. She could feel the fever beginning to take hold, making the world shimmer and blur at the edges. Part of her welcomed it, the promise of an end to the pain, the silence, the crushing weight of loss. She had given up. The woman who had once stood toe to toe with rattlesnakes and nursed sick cattle through bitter winters had finally met something she couldn't fight. The silence wasn't just around her anymore. It was inside her, filling the spaces where hope and determination had once lived. The shadows grew longer as evening approached. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, but Margaret barely heard it. She was slipping away, letting the silence carry her toward whatever came next. The Texas frontier had claimed another victim, and soon the wind would scatter the dust over her bones, erasing the last trace of Margaret O'Brien from the world. But the land had other plans for her. Chapter 2. The Young Warrior's Discovery. Ayana moved through the mesquite brush like a shadow, his moccasins silent on the rocky ground. At 19, he was considered young by Apache standards, but his skills as a scout were already respected among his people. The Lipan Apache had learned to read the signs of the land like sacred text, and today those signs told a story of violence and death. He had been tracking the group of white raiders for 2 days. They had attacked a Comanche camp to the north, stealing horses and leaving destruction in their wake. His war leader, Nalnish, had sent him to learn their numbers and direction. The safety of their own people depended on knowing where these killers would strike next. The smell of smoke had drawn him to the ruined homestead. Ayana approached cautiously, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. The attackers were long gone. He could tell by the way the smoke had thinned and the settled dust, but caution had kept his people alive in this harsh land. He found the man first. The body lay sprawled in the dirt, clearly dead for hours. Ayana studied the scene with practiced eyes, reading the story written in blood and disturbed earth. The raiders had come from the east, at least 6 men on horseback. They had killed quickly and taken everything of value. It was the soft sound of labored breathing that made him turn toward the well. Margaret lay so still that at first glance she appeared to be another casualty. But as Ayana approached, he saw the almost imperceptible rise and fall of her chest. The white woman was alive, barely, and from the look of her wounds and the fever flush on her pale cheeks, she wouldn't be for much longer. Ayana knelt beside her, his dark eyes studying her face. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow and rapid. The wound in her side was inflamed, and he could see the telltale signs of infection setting in. He had seen enough battle wounds to know that without treatment, she would be dead by morning. For a moment, he hesitated. His people and the white settlers were not enemies, but they were not friends either. The Lipan Apache had learned to be wary of all outsiders, especially after years of broken treaties and encroaching settlements. Taking this woman back to his people would raise question, possibly anger. But as he looked at her face, something stirred in his chest. She was young, perhaps not much older than himself, and there was something in her features, even slack with unconsciousness, that spoke of strength and determination. She was a fighter, he could tell, even if she had given up the fight. "You're not ready to walk the spirit trail," he said quietly in Apache, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "Not yet." Ayana made his decision. He couldn't leave her here to die, not when he had the knowledge to save her. His grandmother Itzar had taught him the healing ways alongside the warrior's path. It was considered unusual for a young man to learn such things, but Itzar had insisted that a true warrior must know how to preserve life as well as take it. He lifted Margaret carefully, surprised by how light she felt. The fever had burned away much of her strength, and her body was limp in his arm. She stirred slightly as he moved her, a soft moan escaping her lips, but she didn't wake. Ayana carried her to a small grove of oak trees, about 100 yards from the burned homestead. The shade would provide some relief from the brutal sun, and the location was hidden from view of any travelers on the main trail. He laid her down gently on a bed of fallen leaves, then set about gathering the materials he would need. The healing would not be easy. The wound was infected, and the woman had lost a lot of blood. But Ayana had seen his grandmother work miracles with desert plants and patient care. If this white woman truly was a fighter, if she had even a spark of will left to live, he might be able to save her. As he worked, cleaning the wound with water from his water skin and preparing poultices from the medicinal plants he carried, Ayana wondered what had driven her to this remote place. What dreams had she and her husband chased into this dangerous land? And what would she do if she lived to see another sunrise? The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, when Margaret's eyes finally fluttered open. She looked up at him with confusion and fear, but also with a spark of something else, a flicker of the fight he had sensed in her. "You are safe," he said in English, his accent thick but his words clear. "I will not harm you." Margaret tried to speak, but only a whisper came out. She was still far from healed, but for the first time since the attack, she was no longer alone in the silence. Chapter 3. Between two worlds, Margaret's fever broke on the third day, and with it came a clarity that was both blessing and curse. The Apache who had found her, Ayana, he had told her his name, had built a small shelter from branches and hide, keeping her hidden from the main trail while her body fought off the infection. She watched him now as he prepared another poultice for her wound, his movements sure and practiced. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps still in his teens, with the lean build of someone who had grown up in the desert. His long black hair was tied back with a leather cord, and his dark eyes held an intensity that spoke of wisdom beyond his years. "Why?" she asked, her voice still weak but stronger than it had been. It was the first word she had spoken since regaining consciousness, and Ayana looked up at her with surprise. "Why did you help me?" she clarified, struggling to sit up despite his gentle attempts to keep her lying down. Ayana was quiet for a long moment, his hands stilling on the medicine he was preparing. "My grandmother taught me that all life is sacred," he said finally. "Apache Mexican white. The Great Spirit does not see the color of our skin when he calls us home." Margaret studied his face, looking for deception but finding only sincerity. "Your people and mine, we're not exactly friends." "No," Ayana agreed, "but we are not enemies either. The men who did this to you, they are enemies to both our peoples. They take what they want and leave death behind them." The truth of his words settled over her like a heavy blanket. The raiders who had destroyed her life weren't soldiers or settlers defending their land. They were simply killers who took what they wanted without regard for the consequences. Samuel had died, not because of some grand conflict between peoples, but because he had been in the way of men who valued gold over life. "My husband," she said quietly, the words catching in her throat. "Is he?" "I buried him," Ayana said gently. "In the Christian way. as best I could, near the big cottonwood by the creek." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling fresh tears threaten. Samuel had loved that tree. He had often spoken of building a porch facing it, where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset. Now it would mark his grave instead. "What will you do?" Ayana asked. "When you are healed?" Margaret opened her eyes and looked at him. It was a question she had been avoiding, but she knew she couldn't postpone it forever. "I don't know," she admitted. "I have no family here, no home. The closest town is 3 days' ride, and I have no horse, no money." "You could go back east," Ayana suggested, "to your people there." "With what?" Margaret's voice carried a bitter edge. "I have nothing left. Those men took everything, my husband, my home, my future. What would I tell my sister? That she was right? That I was a fool to come here?" Ayana was quiet, sensing the depth of her despair. He had seen warriors face death with less fear than this woman faced life. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "when we lose everything, we find something we didn't know we were looking for. What could I possibly find here?" Margaret gestured weakly at the vast expanse of desert around them. "This land has taken everything from me." "The land did not take your husband," Ayana said firmly. "Evil men did. The land just is. It can be harsh, yes, but it can also heal. It can hide you when you need hiding, feed you when you need feeding, teach you when you need teaching." Margaret looked at him with new interest. "You speak English very well. My grandfather traded with the white soldiers at Fort Davis. He believed that to survive in this changing world, we must understand all peoples. He taught me your language, your ways, just as he taught me the Apache ways. Is that why you helped me? To understand my ways?" Ayana shook his head. "I helped you because you were dying, and I could not let that happen, but..." He paused, searching for the right words. "I have been thinking about what my grandfather said, about understanding. Perhaps the Great Spirit put you in my path so that we might learn from each other." The idea was strange, almost incomprehensible to Margaret. She had been raised to believe that Apache were savages, dangerous enemies of civilization. Yet here was this young man who had saved her life, who spoke of spirits and healing with the same reverence her grandmother had spoken of God and prayer. "What would I learn from you?" she asked. "How to survive," Ayana said simply. "How to read the signs of the desert, how to find water and food, how to move without being seen, how to live as part of the land instead of fighting against it. And what would you learn from me?" Ayana smiled, the first time she had seen him do so. "Perhaps how to build a house that does not blow away in the wind, how to grow food that lasts through winter, how to..." He struggled for the words. "How to live between two worlds." Margaret felt something stir in her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced since before the attack. It wasn't hope exactly, but it was something close to it. "You want me to stay here?" "Not here," Ayana said, "but not far. There is a place a day's walk to the north, a hidden valley with good water and shelter. It is between the Apache lands and the white settlements, a place where someone could live quietly, bothering no one, alone. If that is what you choose." "But," he met her eyes directly, "I think you have been alone enough, and I think there is more to learn from each other than we can discover in a few days." Margaret lay back down, her mind reeling with possibilities she had never considered. Stay in Texas, learn to live in the desert, trust this young Apache who had saved her life. It seemed impossible, even crazy. But then again, going back to Missouri seemed equally impossible. How could she return to her sister's farm, to sit in parlors and make polite conversation about the weather, knowing what she had seen and lost? How could she pretend that Samuel's death had been just another casualty of westward expansion? "I need time to think," she said finally. "Time is what we have," Ayana replied. "You are not strong enough to travel yet. Rest, heal, and let your heart decide." As night fell over the desert, Margaret found herself listening to the sounds of the wilderness, the distant call of coyotes, the whisper of wind through the mesquite, the crackle of their small fire. For the first time since the attack, the silence didn't feel like a weight pressing down on her. Instead, it felt like a canvas waiting to be painted with new possibilities. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't ready to give up after all. Chapter 4. The Hidden Valley. 2 weeks later, Margaret walked beside Ayana through country unlike anything she had ever seen. The hidden valley he had described lay nestled between two ridges of red rock, accessible only through a narrow canyon that twisted and turned like a snake's path. As they emerged from the canyon's shadows, Margaret stopped and stared in wonder. The valley was an oasis in the harsh desert landscape. A clear stream ran down its center, fed by a spring that bubbled up from beneath a cluster of ancient cottonwoods. The grass was green and thick, and wildflowers dotted the meadow in splashes of yellow and purple. It was perhaps a mile long and half as wide, completely hidden from view unless you knew exactly where to look. "How did you find this place?" Margaret asked, setting down the pack Ayana had fashioned for her from salvaged materials. "My grandfather brought me here when I was 7, Ayana replied, leading her toward the stream. "He called it the Valley of Waiting. He said it was a place where the spirits came to rest between journeys." Margaret knelt by the water's edge and cupped the cool liquid in her hands, drinking deeply. The water was clean and sweet, better than any she had tasted. "Why waiting?" "Because it waits for the right person to need it," Ayana said, settling down beside her. "My grandfather said that sometimes the Great Spirit prepares places for people before they know they need them." As they set up camp near the grove of cottonwoods, Margaret began to understand what Ayana had meant about living as part of the land instead of fighting against it. He showed her how to read the signs that indicated the best places to build shelter, how to find the plants that would provide both food and medicine, how to move through the landscape without leaving traces that might attract unwanted attention. "The desert teaches patience," he explained as they gathered materials for a more permanent shelter. "In the green lands to the east, you plant seeds and they grow quickly. Here you must wait for the right season, the right rain, the right conditions. But when something grows in the desert, it is strong. It endured." Margaret found herself drawn into this new way of thinking. She had been raised to believe that humans were meant to dominate the land, to bend it to their will through hard work and determination. But Ayana showed her a different path, one of partnership and respect, of learning to work with the natural world instead of against it. Over the following days, their routine developed naturally. Ayana would leave early in the morning to hunt or gather, returning with rabbits, wild plants, and news from the outside world. Margaret, still recovering from her injuries, focused on learning the skills that would allow her to survive in this harsh environment. She learned to identify edible plants, prickly pear cactus that provided both fruit and water, mesquite pods that could be ground into flour, wild onions that grew near the stream. She learned to read the weather signs in the clouds and wind, to predict when the fierce desert storms would come and how to take shelter from them. But more than practical skills, she was learning to see the world through different eyes. Where she had once seen only barren wasteland, she now saw a complex ecosystem full of life and beauty. The desert had its own rhythm, its own quiet music that spoke to something deep in her soul. "You are different now," Ayana observed one evening as they sat by their fire, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "How so?" Margaret asked, though she felt the truth of his words. "When I found you, you were like a flower torn from its roots, dying in the sun. Now," he paused, searching for the right words, "now you are like a desert plant, growing deep roots, learning to bloom where you are planted." Margaret considered this. "I feel different, stronger somehow, but also smaller, if that makes sense." "It does," Ayana nodded. "The desert teaches humility. It shows us that we are part of something larger than ourselves. Your people, they try to make themselves bigger than the land. My people, we try to make ourselves part of the land. Both ways have wisdom, but perhaps the true wisdom is finding balance between them." As the weeks passed, Margaret began to understand what Ayana meant about living between two worlds. She was no longer the proper frontier wife who had arrived in Texas with dreams of taming the wilderness. But neither was she Apache, despite the skills she was learning. She was something new, something that perhaps hadn't existed before. A bridge between two ways of life. The realization came to her one morning as she knelt by the stream, washing clothes in the traditional Apache manner Ayana had taught her. She had been thinking about Samuel, remembering their dreams of building a ranch, of raising cattle and children in the wide open spaces of Texas. The grief was still there, but it was no longer the crushing weight it had been. Instead, it had become part of her, like a scar that marks a wound but also shows healing. "I'm not going back," she said, when Ayana returned from his morning hunt. "Not to Missouri, not to the white settlements. I'm staying here." Ayana set down the rabbits he had caught and studied her face. "You are certain?" "I'm certain." Margaret stood up, brushing dirt from her skirt, a skirt that was now patched with buckskin and adapted for desert living. "This place, it's not what I planned, but it's what I need. And I think maybe I'm what it needs too." "What do you mean?" Margaret looked around the hidden valley, at the stream and the cottonwoods, at the red rocks that sheltered them from the outside world. "You said this was a place of waiting. Maybe it was waiting for someone to tend it, to care for it, someone who understands both worlds." Ayana smiled, understanding dawning in his eyes. "A guardian." "Yes," Margaret said, feeling the rightness of it settle into her bones. "A guardian, someone who can help others who might need what this place offers, a safe haven between worlds." As she spoke, Margaret realized that she was no longer the woman who had been left for dead beside a ruined homestead. She had been reborn in this hidden valley, shaped by the desert and the wisdom of a young Apache warrior who had seen something worth saving in her brokenness. The silent widow had found her voice again, and it was singing a song of survival, of hope, of new beginnings blooming in the most unlikely places. Chapter 5. The Test of Fire. 3 months had passed since Margaret first arrived in the hidden valley, and she had settled into a rhythm of life that felt both foreign and familiar. The simple dwelling she and Ayana had constructed from stone and wood stood sturdy against the desert winds, and the small garden she had planted using Apache techniques was beginning to flourish. But their peaceful existence was about to be tested. Ayana returned from one of his scouting trips with news that made Margaret's blood run cold. The same group of raiders who had destroyed her homestead had been spotted moving through the area again. And this time, they weren't just stealing and killing. They were actively hunting Apache, collecting scalps for bounties offered by corrupt officials in distant towns. "They are camped 2 days' ride from here," Ayana reported, his face grim. 6 men, heavily armed. "They have been tracking my people, but they have not found our winter camp yet." Margaret felt the familiar chill of fear, but it was different now. Not the paralyzing terror she had experienced during the attack on her homestead, but a fierce, protective anger. "What can we do?" "We?" Ayana looked at her with surprise. "This is not your fight, Margaret. You could stay here, keep hidden. They would never find this valley." "Like hell it's not my fight," Margaret shot back, her voice hard with determination. "These men killed my husband. They would have killed me too if you hadn't found me. And now they're hunting your people?" She shook her head. "No, I won't hide while they commit murder." And over the next day, they developed a plan that would have seemed impossible to either of them months earlier. Margaret would use her knowledge of white settlements and the raiders' likely thinking to help predict their movements, while Ayana would use his Apache skills to track and harass them. Together, they would try to lead the raiders away from the Apache winter camp and into a trap. The plan was dangerous, requiring Margaret to venture closer to the raiders than she had ever wanted to come again. But as she prepared her few belongings and checked the rifle Ayana had taught her to use, she felt no fear, only a cold, clear purpose. "You have changed much," Ayana observed as they prepared to leave the valley. "The woman I found by the well would not have chosen to fight." "The woman you found by the well was dying," Margaret replied, adjusting the pack on her shoulders. "I'm not dying anymore." They left the valley in the pre-dawn darkness, moving through the desert with a stealth that would have been impossible for the old Margaret. The skills Ayana had taught her, how to read the land, how to move without being seen, how to become part of the landscape, had transformed her into something new. Their first task was to locate the raiders' exact position and confirm their numbers. They found the camp at midday, hidden in a box canyon that offered good water and shelter. Margaret studied the men through Ayana's spyglass, her jaw tightening as she recognized the leader, a scarred man with cold eyes who had been one of the killers at her homestead. "Jake Morrison," she whispered. "I remember him. He was the one who—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Ayana understood. "Then we will make sure he pays for what he has done." Ayana said quietly. Their strategy was simple but effective. Margaret would create false trails and signs that would suggest Apache movement in the wrong direction, while Ayana would use his knowledge of the desert to set traps and ambushes. They would pick off the raiders one by one, using the harsh environment as their ally. The first test came that evening. Margaret, dressed in clothes that made her look like a settler fleeing Apache attack, deliberately allowed herself to be spotted by the raiders' scouts. She played the part of a terrified woman, claiming her wagon train had been attacked, and she was the only survivor. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face, tears that were real, born of remembered pain. "They killed everyone. My husband, my children. I've been running for days." The scouts, greedy for information about Apache movements, brought her to Morrison's camp. As she had hoped, they were more interested in what she could tell them about Apache positions than in helping her. She fed them false information, describing Apache camps in areas far from the real winter camp, painting a picture of a large war party moving toward the Mexican border. "You're sure about this?" Morrison demanded, his scarred face twisted with suspicion. "I saw them with my own eyes," Margaret replied, letting her voice shake with convincing fear. "At least 50 warriors, maybe more. They were painted for war, heading south toward the river." Morrison's greed overcame his caution. The bounty on Apache scalps was too tempting to ignore, and Margaret's story promised a rich harvest. He ordered his men to break camp immediately and follow the false trail she had described. What the raiders didn't know was that Margaret had led them directly into Ayana's trap. As they rode through a narrow canyon, following the false sign she had created, Ayana struck from the shadows. His first arrow took down one of the rear guards silently, and by the time the others realized they were under attack, it was too late. The battle was brief but fierce. The raiders, accustomed to attacking helpless settlers, found themselves facing an enemy who knew every rock and shadow in the desert. Ayana moved like a ghost, appearing and disappearing among the boulders, his arrows finding their marks with deadly precision. Margaret, hidden in a concealed position above the canyon, provided covering fire with her rifle. She had never killed a man before, but as she sighted down the barrel at Morrison, the man who had murdered her husband, she felt no hesitation. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and Morrison toppled from his horse. His reign of terror finally ended. When the smoke cleared, 4 of the raiders were dead, including Morrison. 1 had escaped, wounded, and fleeing south toward Mexico. The 6th, trapped and cornered, threw down his weapons and begged for mercy. "Please," he pleaded. "I was just following orders. I never wanted to hurt nobody." Margaret looked at the cowering man, remembering her own pleas for mercy that had gone unheard. For a moment, she felt the temptation to show him the same compassion he had shown her family. But then she thought of Samuel, of the Apache families these men had destroyed, of all the innocent lives that had been lost to their greed. "You're going to ride out of here," she said, her voice steady as stone. "You're going to ride far away, and you're never going to come back. And you're going to spread the word that these lands are protected now. That anyone who comes here with murder in their hearts will find death waiting for them." The raider nodded frantically, scrambling onto his horse and fleeing into the desert. Margaret watched him go, knowing that her message would spread. The hidden valley and the lands around it would be safe, protected by the reputation of the Apache warrior and the white woman who had become something more than either. As she and Ayana made their way back to the valley, Margaret felt a profound sense of completion. She had faced her demons and emerged victorious, not through revenge, but through justice. She had protected the innocent and punished the guilty, bridging the gap between 2 worlds with courage and determination. The silent widow had become a guardian indeed, and the desert had witnessed the birth of a legend. Chapter 6. The Guardian's Legacy. 1 year after the battle in the canyon, the hidden valley had become something Margaret could never have imagined. Word of the White Guardian and her Apache partner had spread throughout the region, but not in the way she had expected. Instead of bringing trouble, their reputation had brought something else entirely: hope. The first refugee had arrived in early spring, a young Mexican woman named Rosa, whose family had been killed by bandits. She had heard whispers in the border towns of a place where people could find safety, where a woman who understood loss would offer shelter to those who had nowhere else to go. Margaret had welcomed Rosa with open arms, recognizing in her the same broken spirit she had once carried. Together, they had expanded the garden and built a second dwelling, creating space for others who might need sanctuary. By summer, 3 more had arrived. An elderly Apache man named Nalnish, who had been cast out by his tribe for speaking against war. A young Chinese immigrant named Wei, who had fled persecution in California, and a freed slave named Josiah, who was making his way north but had been injured by slave catchers. Each brought their own skills and stories, their own pieces of the puzzle that would make the valley a true refuge. Nalnish shared his knowledge of desert medicine and spiritual healing. Wei proved to be a skilled craftsman who could build almost anything from the materials at hand. Josiah, once healed, became their link to the network of people helping former slaves reach freedom. Margaret found herself at the center of it all, not as a leader in the traditional sense, but as a bridge between different worlds and ways of life. She had learned to speak basic Apache from Ayana, Spanish from Rosa, and enough Chinese from Wei to make herself understood. More importantly, she had learned to listen, to hear the stories that people carried, and to understand what they needed to heal. "You have become what my grandfather dreamed of," Ayana told her one evening as they sat by the stream, watching the sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of gold and red, a place where all peoples can find peace. Margaret smiled, her hand resting on the small swell of her belly. The news of her pregnancy had been a surprise to everyone, including herself. At 33, she had thought that chapter of her life was closed forever. But life, it seemed, had a way of offering new beginnings when least expected. "Do you think Samuel would understand?" she asked, a question that had been weighing on her heart. "I think," Ayana said carefully, "that Samuel would want you to live, to be happy, to build something good from the ashes of what was lost." Margaret nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle into her soul. She had spent months feeling guilty about finding happiness after such loss, but gradually she had come to understand that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant learning to carry the love and the loss together, letting both shape who she became. The baby's father was Ayana, though their relationship had grown so naturally that neither could pinpoint exactly when friendship had become something deeper. They had been through too much together, shared too many quiet moments and dangerous adventures for love to be anything but inevitable. "What will we call him?" Ayana asked, his hand joining hers on her belly. "How do you know it's a boy?" Margaret laughed. "The way you carry yourself. My grandmother taught me to read the signs." He paused, then added more seriously, "I would like to give him both names. One Apache, one white, so he will know he belongs to both worlds." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "Samuel," she said quietly. "If it's a boy, Samuel is his white name. After my husband who brought me to this land where I could find my true purpose. And Ashki," Ayana added, "it means boy in Apache, but also young warrior, one who will grow up to protect what we have built here." As autumn arrived, the valley welcomed its most unusual residents yet. A small group of former Confederate soldiers who had deserted after witnessing atrocities they couldn't stomach. They arrived gaunt and haunted, expecting to be turned away or worse. Instead, they found acceptance and a chance to rebuild their lives. Margaret had been hesitant at first. These men represented everything she had been taught to fear about the lawless frontier. But as she listened to their stories, she realized that they too were refugees from violence and hatred. They had chosen to walk away from war, to seek a better path, and that choice deserved respect. Under Josiah's guidance, they learned to work alongside the freed slave who had found his own sanctuary in the valley. It was a transformation that spoke to the healing power of the place they had all created together. The first snows of winter brought news from the outside world. A territorial marshal had been asking questions about the White Guardian and her diverse community. Some officials, it seemed, were concerned about the mixing of races and cultures in the hidden valley. "They want to know if we're a threat," Josiah reported after speaking with contacts in the nearest town. "If we're planning some kind of uprising." Margaret laughed, though there was no humor in it. "An uprising? We're a bunch of broken people trying to heal together. If that's threatening to them, it says more about them than about us." But the threat was real, and they all knew it. The valley's isolation had protected them so far, but official attention could bring problems they weren't prepared to face. They began making plans for what they would do if authorities came calling. It was Ayanna who proposed the solution that would ensure their safety and their mission's continuation. "We make it legal," he said. "We claim the land officially, make it a proper settlement. Then we're not hiding, we're homesteading." Margaret understood immediately. By establishing the valley as a legitimate settlement, they could protect themselves with the same laws that protected other frontier communities. It would mean paperwork, official recognition, and probably some unwanted attention, but it would also mean security. The baby was born on a crisp December morning, arriving with the determination that seemed to run in his family. Samuel Ashki Martinez O'Brien. They had decided to honor both of his parents' names, was perfect in every way, with his father's dark hair and his mother's stubborn chin. As Margaret held her son for the first time, surrounded by the diverse family they had created in the Hidden Valley, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. The woman who had been left for dead beside a ruined homestead seemed like a stranger now, someone she had known long ago in a different life. "Welcome to the world, little warrior," she whispered to Samuel Ashki. "You're going to grow up in a place where differences are celebrated, where people from all walks of life can find peace together. Your father and we're going to make sure of that." The Hidden Valley was no longer hidden. It was becoming something new, a beacon of hope.